Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a lecturer, a climate corruption reporter, and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and political crises that we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is Max Isle. Max is a fellow at Ghent University, researching the climate and agrarian issues. He's also the author of the book, A People's Green New Deal. Max joined me to talk about land, the importance of land reform, of political relationships to land in the Global South, how the Global South's relationship to land impacts the Global North. He explains how liberation is found in agrarian reform when people are awarded back their land in order to feed themselves and their family and to create cohesion for communities. This is essentially post-colonial planning. And Max explains that the reason to not give people back their lands, the reason to not sort of encourage a peasant class, and he explains the use of the word peasant in the episode, but the reason to not afford people their land is that capitalism needs a surplus of labour. And a surplus of labour helps maintain this global system of inequality and inequity that is driving the climate crisis and sees billions of people all around the world driven into poverty or refused an escape from poverty, even though we have more than enough resources to go around. This is a phenomenally interesting episode. Max talks about counter-revolutions, he talks about agrarian reform and policy over the decades. He gives lots of different examples from countries all over the world that have attempted or are currently attempting agrarian reform, and ultimately frames it all within the Globalization project. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you're loving the show, support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. By signing up, you'll also get access to the weekly article I write, inspired by each interview. Thank you to everyone who has signed up and is supporting the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Max, great to have you on the show. I'm so excited for what we're going to talk about today.
Thank you so much for scheduling this.
Oh, my pleasure. So I whizzed through your the work that you sent me, and I've been aware of your work for a while, but for listeners, could you give sort of a whistle-stop tour of your career and your research thus far?
Yes, I work on the role of agriculture in development and underdevelopment on a world scale. In particular, I work on the role of the agrarian question, or the role of agriculture and peasants in the Arab region, and especially North Africa, and within North Africa, Tunisia, during the national liberation struggle and during thinking about post-colonial planning through successive iterations and stages. And more recently, I have been researching green transitions and Green New Deals and heterodox alternatives to the more mainstream Green New Deals, as well as the role of agriculture and peasants, both in the third world, but also farmers in the first world, in a possible just green transition.
Gosh, there's so much to go on there. The first thing that I want to jump into, actually, and this is going completely non-chronologically, so please bear with me, but that word, peasants, and your research on them, I'd really love to get stuck into that, because I think, certainly from what I'm seeing on some people, their vision of a green transition definitely involves maintaining a peasant class, but calling them stewards, for example. And I suppose, what does your research say about that political relationship in a green transition, and also the political relationship, well, I suppose now, of how peasants live even still in sort of today's modern world, even though we have so many resources to go around?
Right. So the technical answer to that is, of course, that the peasant class typically referred to smallholders producing primarily for subsistence with an element of production for the market. Now, when we use peasant more colloquially, especially within agrarian studies, but also within the South, where the term doesn't come freighted with the same connotations and even denotations as it comes with in the North, where you use word campesino or you use felahín. It's not coming with the same kind of very complicated. People are like, are you referring to serfs? Are you referring to people living under a brutal feudal landlord? Like, no, we're just talking about people who in one way or another are making a living from the land on a relatively small scale. So in that sense, a green transition is premised on what we consider a route to development or escape from underdevelopment. That is, the term can't be thought outside of how we think it's possible for places in the third world to develop. That is, to achieve a decent level of access to all the things that one could plausibly understand as the baseline for a decent life for the across the entirety of the population. And then in the first world, it takes on the developed world, for the term, takes on a different inflection where it's about putting in place a sustainable pattern of interaction, or again, to be technical, metabolism between human production, human societies, and the non-human environment. And in both cases, of course, that metabolism, that interaction is heavily mediated by farmers, peasants, people involved in agriculture, because agriculture in its very many forms is a kind of blanket or membrane that covers most of the world's habited surface, right? It is the overwhelming method by which humans are interacting with non-human nature, and therefore it's very important from a ecological sustainability perspective. From a developmental perspective, the reason the peasant class is so critical in the countries of the South is that the basic problem of the countries of the South is, how are you going to get resources that you can invest in improving your infrastructure and your productive force? That is, you decide you need machine tools, you decide you need factories, you decide you want to be producing your own clothing, you decide you want to be producing your own furniture and so forth, right? There's also things that you won't be able to produce, but you need to import, whether in the short, medium, or long term, electronics or cars, or the engineering tools for high-speed rail and so forth, right? You need capital for that. Where is capital going to come from in a poor country? You could take a debt, but you could take on debt from the IMF, the World Bank, or the United States and Europe. And we see how this is going, right? There's actually, I think, a 35% increase in the burden of debt repayments. Ghana just over the last year and a half, because of the increases in interest rates, and because there was extensive borrowing over the last year, over the last decade, because of low interest rates, Ghana just defaulted on its debt. Tunisia is basically has been had its credit currently downgraded, which means it's ever more expensive to get debt, and they're not even clear how they're going to finance their next debt payments and continue to finance the budget and so forth, right? So there's actually a capital constraint on development, which is not the way we think about development in the North. Sometimes in the North, people will say, "Oh, well, we don't have money in the budget for health spending." Right? But anyone with sense knows that that is in fact nonsense, right? We always know it's a political choice, right? We know very well that there is in fact resources available for things like, if you're an American, things like universal health care, right? There are resources available for such things. It's that the state is making a political choice not to invest in such resources, right? And, the decision to start to gut the National Health Service in the UK, or the decision to progressively privatize previously public health services and put ever more of the burden on the working class across Europe, right? And a lot of Europe anyway. These are all political choices. These aren't really, although the rhetoric is the rhetoric claims that this is a problem of resource constraints. In reality, you just need a little financial economic awareness to understand that there's not a resource constraint. In the South, the issue is very different. Right? In the south, the place like Tunisia does not have enough resources to be importing cereals and machine tools and food oils and so forth, right? So,
Sorry, Max, when you say resources here, you mean capital?
I mean, capital. Yeah. It does not have enough
Yeah.
capital. It doesn't have enough financial resources, capital to be financing all of its needs, which is why it has a balance of payments crisis, right? It has debt outflows, interest on the debt, outflowing capital. And then it also is needing to purchase ever more things that are ever more expensive on world markets. And there's literally not enough, there does not seem to be enough capital in the country to do so, absent very large politically difficult taxes on the wealth holders in Tunisia, and even that probably I very much doubt it would be sufficient, right? So that there's a fundamental capital constraint on development, which means you need to be thinking seriously: how are you going to get capital for development, and how are you going to lift people out of poverty at the same time? Okay, well, we know how to do it. Really, we know that, for example, if you look at agriculture, this is without getting to the ecological question, although it's inseparable from that. We know, for example, that small farmers are massively more productive per unit of land than large farmers, right? This is very well known. It's extremely well established. The reason is not something that's great from a humane perspective. It's often because small farmers are willing to work harder on the land, right? Nevertheless, if you, in a country like Tunisia, but also many, many other post-colonial countries, if the issue is that you have an excess of labor, right? If that's your fundamental kind of factor imbalance, that you have a huge amount of labor available, which is the case across Latin America, across Africa, across West Asia, across Africa, across huge portions of South and to a lesser extent East Asia, right? You have unemployment rates between 15 and 45%, right? So you actually have capacity to mobilize labor and apply it to land. And the best way to do that is to carry out an agrarian reform. It is to actually increase the size of the units of land available to the poorest people, which right now could be 1 or 2 or 3 hectares in a place like Tunisia, whereas you need a minimum of 10 just for self-provision for a small family, right? In the more temperate areas. This is just an example using the country I know best, right? So automatically you would increase national production and you would increase the well-being of the poorest sectors of your population, right? So this is actually a developmental imperative. Therefore, if this is a developmental imperative without the question of ecology, unless there's some overriding ecological reason to say we shouldn't be doing that, then it should be an overriding developmental imperative in any form of green transition. Now, luckily, in many marginal lands in the third world, and also non-marginal lands, you can radically increase yields using very sustainable farming methods, right? Using relatively fewer amounts of inputs. And this is a technology called agroecology. It's actually just an elaboration of the technical logic and an elaboration of the intellectual basis underpinning the technical logic of so-called traditional farming. It's actually just low input farm, right? On a microeconomic level, you actually get increased revenues on a farm level. On an ecological level, you get much better ecological outcomes. You get better biodiversity outcomes because self-evidently you are not using pesticides. You get better soil health. You get increased earthworms. You get vastly increased soil organic matter, but basically massively increased soil carbon, right? You decrease erosion. You also get crops that are more resilient to drought, that are more resilient to flood, that bounce back quicker, to soil that bounces back quicker after hurricanes, and that you're able to crop it more immediately. It means it's less vulnerable to mudslides. It's less vulnerable to blights and various pests and so forth, right? So from an ecological perspective, this is also, it's a win-win. To use this phrase, right? So therefore, it needs to be centralized in any form of green transition. And it is actually, unfortunately, very much absent from a lot of the ecological discussion that is happening, not only in the global north, but to some extent in the global south as well, insofar as the north is able to set the pace and agenda of the discussion.
And why do you think it is absent from most of these discussions and plans?
It's absent because people are not accustomed to thinking about where they get their food, essentially. And people are not accustomed to thinking about developmental needs of people who don't look like themselves. So, intellectually speaking, you have people generally are in northern universities or northern financial institutions, or to a lesser extent, northern developmental institutions, right? Who are able to set the agenda implicitly or explicitly for northern green thinking. And to that extent, it's very organic to have a huge blind spot when it comes to the developmental needs of the poor, of the periphery, of the third world, right? This is a huge part of it. It's not just a blindness that is reflecting spatial or geographical location, right? I mean, everybody inevitably has blindnesses when it comes to what we can and can't see. It also, in fact, it reflects a power dynamic, right? The poorest people in the world actually play a fundamental role in stabilizing the system we live in, right? If you want to control wages on a world scale, then you need labor reserves. You need a reserve army of labor. This is very well established, right? I mean, this is the Federal Reserve optimum unemployment. Like, why is it optimum that people are unemployed, right? It's crazy, right? Um, Now, the labor reserves function differently in the South and in the North. In the North, with the exception maybe of the European periphery and so forth, who have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% unemployment. In the South, unemployment is massive and systemic, right? Unemployment and underemployment is 50, 20, 25, 30, 45, 50. As far as this could be 70%. We can say it's a special case, but actually I think it crystallizes the problems of the system. Unemployment, and that means okay, you have a constant downwards pressure on wages, which means that the labor share of consumption on a world scale is constantly suppressed and is able to be suppressed by the existence of these massive labor reservoirs. Now, it's not like people in the North, even progressive people, are like, well, I want to preserve, the structural imbalance of the world economic system. And therefore, I want to preserve labor reservoirs. Therefore, I'm not going to see agriculture. That's not how ideology works, right? Ideology is a way we make sense of factual or empirical and historical terrain that we see in front of us. It's like, oh, ideology, that makes sense. That's how the landscape works. That's how things work. And therefore, I look over there and I'm looking at what development, underdevelopment, ecology, and so forth. I just don't see agriculture. I just don't see peasants. Now, this isn't bad, right? But it's an organic element of the reproduction of the world. If you just don't see the problem that's really at the root of all the other problems, then it's natural that it has a stabilizing effect on the system if you can't address the problem at its very root, right? You can't say, where is the root? I don't even see the root. I don't even see that problem. Therefore, it isn't addressed. Therefore, you end up in a pro-systemic or stabilizing role. Therefore, it's an organic fact to not see the need for small peasant-led development on a world scale, right? And this is why I can elaborate on some cases where this has happened and what the way people have reacted to it in recent times and historically. This is actually a very modern phenomenon. If you go to the development discussions in the 50s and 60s, the third world was agrarian reform. Everybody agreed universally, you need an agrarian reform in order to develop. And even in the first world, with the advent of like modernization theory and so forth, right? The Alliance for Progress in Latin America, pro-middle farmer agrarian reforms in various countries of the world, top-down agrarian reforms in Allied occupied U.S. occupied East Asia and so forth. It was actually understood that agrarian reform would have a progressive role in contributing surplus for industrialization and actually improving the development of the society in one form or another, even if those agrarian reforms were not anything I myself approve of from a radical or and people-centered perspective, right? It was very much on the agenda. Then it got off the agenda, right? And it's a more historical question that we don't need to delve into right now as to why it got off the agenda. But the fact that it's off the agenda is actually leads to the stabilization of the underdevelopment of most of the world, and also the effective blocking of paths for just ecologically sustainable development in the poorer parts of the world system.
I would be interested to understand a little bit more why it went off the agenda. I think that's quite important context, especially when we're dealing with things changing so quickly and, shifting baseline syndrome. The fact that everybody thinks that whatever's been normal for the past 5 years tends to be the norm for forever. Do you know why it was taken off the agenda?
Same way anything good is ever taken off the agenda on a world scale, which is counter-revolution, right? It's counter-revolution on a world scale and counter-revolution within countries themselves. So when you look at what happened in Brazil with the João government was supporting the peasant leagues in Brazil in the early 1960s, and then there was a savage military coup, and thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, I don't know how many, were killed, imprisoned, sent into exile, and so forth, including a lot of the radical intelligentsia. Therefore, you don't have a discussion of a land to the peasant agrarian reform. Easy, right? Same thing in Chile, right? Once you have murdered Salvador Allende, right, and thrown people into prison, assassinated people in their homes, or if you're in Argentina and you're the military dictatorship and you put concrete blocks around people's feet, you're also funded heavily by the U.S. to do so, spread fascism across the Southern Cone, and then they don't talk about agrarian reform. If they're they get a little bit more organized, like in Nicaragua, then you finance U.S. proxy army to actually erase people from existence, and you carry out basically a savage war of aggression against them in order to stop in order to try and freeze their process of changing the distribution of power in their society. You turn the country to a basket case, right? You impose all sorts of sanctions on it. Then when the country when even the progressive wing of the country becomes more and more it develops more and more internal problems and corruptions and so forth, you say, oh, wow, these people are really corrupt. Then suddenly you're talking about corruption instead of agrarian reform, right? And the U.S. role and the NATO role stymieing agrarian. Right? Same thing in Syria. Syria was carrying out a radical land-to-tiller agrarian reform through 1966, 1967. I mean, the Baathists were fusing with Marxist-Leninist ideology, and the intelligentsia and the political leadership was heavily influenced by the Chinese Revolution and Maoism. Then they were hammered by Israel. And then suddenly the project of both resisting Israel and also carrying out a domestic agrarian redistribution taken off the agenda. Now, and then you have a kind of stabilization of a middle peasant past. But why? Why was it? Now, it was on the agenda because it was basically a given of the post-colonial governments across the entire post-colonial world. Their legitimacy rested on actually delivering something to the masses. This is what Fanon said. What did Fanon say? Fanon said, what do people want? They want land and bread, right? Or they want land as a means to get bread, right? This was elemental, right? People wanted access to land. It was the fundamental aspect of support for the anti-colonial national liberation struggles across the entire periphery, that people would have the right to land and national development, that the land would both contribute to and be a component, and therefore would be a component of, right? And it was the same in Latin America, especially with the Cuban Revolution. Suddenly it was understood that you could actually change the existing structure, radically change the existing structure of landed property, right? Now, with the rollback of all of these attempts, and then of course the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Chinese turn away from peasant-led growth, you start, they were a kind of, you could think of them as kind of this kind of like reactor that was radiating this idea of an alternative way of structuring the domestic order, the domestic class structure of other societies. So it was constantly putting on the agenda. Now, what you saw from 1990, I mean, agrarian reform popped off the agenda, right? It was totally off the agenda uh, all over the world, right? You didn't really have it anymore being discussed until Zimbabwe, right? Until Zimbabwe. And you had certain elements of it in Brazil, for example, and you also had, of course, guerrilla armies advocating for it in Southeast Asia and South Asia, right? But what happens to people like that? Of course, the guerrilla armies are being murdered by the U.S., right, or by U.S. subcontractors, essentially. And if you look at Zimbabwe, then Zimbabwe carries out a radical land-to-tiller agrarian reform where they use a minimal amount of GMO seeds for that matter, right? And they're placed under a vicious economic sanctions for taking land from wealthy white settlers and giving it to poor Black people. And so if every time it happens, one finds you're like, well, this agrarian reform, you know, doesn't quite meet my democratic standards for what is an appropriate agrarian reform, right? Let alone, if Venezuela is placed under, a destabilization attempt and, peasant cadres are constantly being assassinated internally, even during the more radical Chavez years, then of course, agrarian reform is going to fall off the agenda of the South. Agrarian reform is not so much on the agenda of the South. It is naturally, organically not going to be on the agenda of the North, where people are very far from this zone of storms, where people can actually effectively demand, where people feel it in their daily lives that they need to demand a change in the distribution of power in the society in order to have decent lives. So it's organic in a sense that it would be off the agenda in the North. But nevertheless, what is organic is not to say that it's inevitable, right? And I think it's also coming back into attention in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years for a variety of reasons, but one can never insist on it.
Say agrarian reform was to roll out in the global South. Is there a danger that the global North could use the global South's self-development and like contain sort of sustainable societies where a people is fed because they are a member of the peasant class and everybody has access to land, and therefore like the sort of industrial development of those nations would contract or it would certainly decelerate. Is there a danger that the global North could then sort of steal the carbon budgets and cement that power hierarchy of the North being sort of the dominant bullying players and the South being subject to their rule for a far longer time?
It's a huge danger. It's a danger on multiple levels. This is why the classic discussion about agrarian reform was always organically interwoven with a discussion of national sovereign industrialization, right? It was not a question of emphasizing agriculture to the expense of industry, but it was rather a question of putting agriculture on the agenda in situations where the default, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s, amongst people who were anti-agrarian reform, they were often claiming that, in fact, industry by itself could provide a sufficient impetus to develop. Rather, what's very important, and you see it in all the attempts with all their blights of radical nationalist construction, be it Zimbabwe, Bolivia, Venezuela, not always very effectively recently, but industrialization has always been part of the agenda, right? A sovereign industrialization, meaning attempts to basically build at home what you have a history of importing, doing value-added processes domestically and so forth, right? So, of course, it's a huge danger, and this is also this question of, I think one can see the danger kind of presented usually in a bad faith way when people are like, oh, you're fetishizing agriculture, you're fetishizing peasants, you want everyone to live like leprechauns and hobbits and the shires of the South and so forth. It's like, no, in fact, we do need to insist on sovereign industrialization as an ineluctable component of a national sovereign development project. But it doesn't mean that we can say agriculture and agrarian reform in the South are unimportant, or that, for that matter, that the U.S. and Western governments have considered it unimportant. Quite the opposite, right? The places and social formations that they place under the most aggressive siege in the third world are those that put the agrarian question at the center, either discursively or in their actual practice, right? The agrarian question, both in its question of the liberation, the changing of the domestic agrarian structure purely internally, or those that are putting the agrarian question on the agenda in terms of the national control of land as it can be achieved against monopoly capital and proxies like Israel. Palestine is, people talk about apartheid. We'll talk about it. It's fine. Actually, Palestine is an agrarian question. Who controls the land, right? How are you going to get land to Palestinian peasants and slum dwellers unless the situation has been decolonized, right? This is an agrarian question. But of course, also an agrarian question in South Africa, right? And there's also an agrarian question in that is actually seeing some advances in Zimbabwe. There's also a huge agrarian question in the Philippines, which is exporting nurses from their own national budget, their own national education budget. They train these nurses to a very high level, then they export them to the United States. The United States doesn't have to use its resources to train nurses, right? It's actually an extraction of wealth. Now, that is inseparable from the fact that those nurses cannot achieve a high enough wage. Why can't they achieve a high enough wage in the Philippines? Well, this is because there's systemic wage suppression in the Philippines. What is it? Central element of the systemic wage suppression in the Philippines is the fact that you have massive labor reservoirs. Why do you have massive labor reservoirs? Is because you have a massively unequal agrarian structure. Why do you have a massively unequal agrarian structure? Because the main forces that are actually contesting it, which is historically the Communist Party and an armed insurgency, is actually being murdered every single day, practically, in the Philippines hinterlands. How widely is that known amongst progressive people in the United States and Western Europe? Very, 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 very little, right? Which is not to play a blame game, right? It's to say that we need to understand that with all the lights and shadows, what are these forces that are actually trying to change the world, and appreciate that everybody has a role to play. And some of the role to play is saying, okay, we need to make sure that these people over there, in their way, trying to change their situation and their world, is part of also changing our world in a progressive way. And if we can't see them, we got to change our glasses.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's sort of an almost deliberate suppression of progressivism happening in other parts of the world, because the global north, even the progressives in the global north, want to be at the forefront of the changes. We want to be the I don't know, the angels of progressivism, or push the world into a new future, when in fact there are lots of fantastic sort of projects and stories and events and attempts happening everywhere, and they need more attention and they need more support. The solutions are not going to be found in the global north, that is for sure.
Absolutely. And you saw a little comic book that recently came out. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's by this very blonde Swedish fellow, Andreas Malm, who talked about blowing up pipelines. Of course, we can pause and
Talks about what? Blowing up what?
pipelines.
Oh, pipelines. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you may have heard of this little comic book that came out, I think a year or two ago. I mean, first of all, let us discuss that if you actually blow up a pipeline, you actually create a lot of environmental damage. This is one problem of blowing up pipelines. Another problem is, of course, that historically the central force that actually has been throttling the production of oil in target states, be they Iran, historically Iraq from through 1972, Venezuela, and so forth, is the U.S. government. But another thing you can't see from Switzerland or wherever, one of these Arctic places up there in the north. But put that to the side, right? Who is who is the protagonist when you're talking about blowing up pipelines? You're talking about Northerners blowing up pipelines. Actually, I was just doing an interview with Dango Sambasila, the leading Senegalese or West African development economist. He was talking about how Senegal is now looking forward to having more oil reserves available, right? The idea of blowing up pipelines. I mean, these countries, which like Senegal, which are not responsible at all for global warming, at all, and which need to develop, want to mobilize their oil reserves, not blow up their pipelines, but mobilize their oil reserves for their sovereign development, right? If you don't want them to do that, well, then get them capital grants, right? Struggle for that.
Yeah.
But don't be talking about blowing up their pipelines. Now, these are the argument that the central modality for climate change in the global north should be blowing up pipelines rather than opening pipelines of cash to the global south is something you can only dream up. The Arctic.
Yeah.
It's a very silly idea.
Yeah. I know what you mean, but I think there's a big question mark over what industrialization or development even looks like in a green transition. I think it is so hard for people to imagine. I certainly struggle to imagine, like, what if a country was to bypass its oil and gas industrialization and say we were to open pipelines of capital instead, which of course is sort of the hope for what's it called? There's a loss and damage fund, and then there's another COP26 fund, which has been chronically underfunded. Like, what does that look like for people? How can we have a green transition that also really amplifies development and a kind of, I don't know, a renewable industrialization? Because from what I see, most of the talks about a green transition focus on trying to substitute the fossil fuel economy for a renewable one, which isn't possible. But then also, as I said before, kind of demanding that like 1 billion people or 2 billion people will be land stewards. And that's it. And that's what they and their children will have to be in order to protect the land from the resource grabbing global north that hasn't been able to get its appetite in check.
Right. Honestly, I haven't seen this rhetoric of land storage, so I'd be happy to know where I can see it. But I mean, I definitely understand where you're talking about. I'm just interested in seeing the specific places where it's discussed. We have to look at it from both directions at once. I mean, on the one hand, this is a plausible path for sovereign development in the South. On the other hand, I 100% agree with what you are pointing out, is that there's this sense that the people in the South will be like the conservators and the implementers of natural climate solutions and carbon farming and so forth, and maybe could be poorly paid biodiversity stewards or guardians or keepers of the keys and so forth, invest swaths of the global South, and this will be their new role as the low-paid kind of social reproducers of the non-human. So this is why we really need to keep the macro view in mind. The macro question, the big question for the South is their right to determine their path of sovereign development, right? Which, of course, we want to be ecological. Of course, they want to be ecological, but because there's a massive ecological crisis endogenous to the South. Right. I mean, there is the appropriation of commons for not even for solar parks, right? It's happening in India, for example. It's been extensively written about. There's questions of where you site windmills. Major issue in southern Mexico has vast distributional consequences, right? Where are you going to site a windmill? If you site a windmill on people's agricultural land, you're actually effectuating a land grab, and that energy is going towards often export-oriented industrialization. So it can, without paying attention to the larger developmental framework, and also, in fact, the right of countries to articulate a sovereign developmental path for themselves, or preferably confederated, that is linked together on a regional level, then you aren't going to, any of these ways of framing it is going to end up redounding to the benefit of international, and that is northern monopoly capital, which is exactly the case for these so-called natural climate solutions, right? So this is why these questions of biodiversity conservation, these questions of seeding carbon into the soil, these questions of preserving forests, right, need to be articulated with this question of development, but also need to be articulated accordingly with this question of political rights, right? Political rights both on the micro level, but political rights also on the national level, and then the respect for the political rights, which then becomes an international. So there is a fellow, Forrest Fleischman, who's been doing very, very good work about the attempted reforestation plans for South Asia. And he says, when these are imposed from above, they make no sense at all. They tend not to lead to any successes. But in South
Oh,
Asia,
really? Why is that?
well, they tend to just be throwing forest seeds for trees everywhere, basically, and then they count them
Right.
as a carbon credit, basically. So it's often ecologically appropriate places. There often are isn't an articulation of, what role does a forest play in local economic development, right? That's a serious
Yeah.
question. In fact, a forest can play a very serious role in local economic development. Right? A forest can provide both whatever grows on the trees themselves. It can provide lumber if it's logged sustainably. Um, it's possible it can provide fuel, although it's not necessarily the preferred way. It can to be securing fuel for warmth and energy and so forth. Right now, the point is that forests can provide much that's usable for human beings, provided that there is, again, a macro framework for how we understand the social use of forests, right? And this is why we can't, if you just think of forests as these big carbon vaults that we should just be throwing everywhere, and the more of them you have, the more carbon vaults you have, you don't end up with an effective way of thinking about ecological preservation. And this is why all the
Yeah.
good work, including really a central facet of what's called the indigenous question, which is has problems in its framing, to be sure, I think. But a lot of the indigenous question, and this really it tends to be sidelined in too much of the mainstream fetishization of the indigenous question, is the indigenous question is about land rights, right? The indigenous question is a political question about control over the land. Therefore, if there's
Yeah.
political control over the land, not just the land that people have, but also the land that they have a treaty right to, and also the land that they were bullied into surrendering via coercive treaties and so forth, right? And also maybe the land that they would like a right to in Palestine or West Papua or the Western Sahara, for example, right?
Yeah.
If you have a political framework for the protection of your land, which includes the land that is forested, then you actually have a political framework for not subordinating biodiversity protection to national development, but
Yeah.
integrating
Yeah.
forest preservation and biodiversity protection with a specific vision, or constituting a vision of national development, which is contingent on political rights that then require political force, that is political power,
Yeah.
to protect. And that political power comes both locally, but also comes from the withdrawal of threats against that political, the defense of that political power. Which means a transformative obligation is not just cheering for people in the South, although yes, I cheer for Palestinians, but it's also saying, okay, there is coercion being applied to these people's right to exercise political
Yeah.
self-determination over their own lands, territories, political futures. I need to withdraw from that coercive process, which means contesting the government that is doing carrying out the coercion.
Yeah, absolutely. But how does this all relate back to globalization? Because it would seem to me that capitalism, even though sort of it, one of the great myths is that it fosters innovation, it seems to punish heterogeneous societies. Because a heterogeneous society would, I would imagine, like demand more of an active and visible police or security service. Whereas the whole illusion of capitalism depends on this idea that everybody's free, and yet and for them to self-police, it's this theory of precarity. And I suppose self-policing, or the encouragement of self-policing, is much easier when everybody in a society looks the same, and that is why they would attempt to not just grab resources in terms of resources that can then be put on the national market or the international market, but also in a bid to minimize the differences between members of their society.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think there is a push towards homogenization and punishment to some extent of heterogeneity, but we also see, a Western recuperation of all forms of many varieties of heterogeneity. That is a recuperation, that is a kind of scrutinizing it, taking certain elements from it, depoliticizing them, and then presenting it in a depoliticized way. So I don't think it's the countries that per se that are
Mm.
heterogeneous that are being punished, or that there's a flattening. I mean, this idea of globalization is, the globalization. My advisor Shomak Michael used to call it the globalization project, right, rather than globalizations, because we've always been global, right?
Yeah,
Civilizations.
yeah.
There's always been articulated links between various forms of production and consumption, whether more marginal or more centralized, right? So the question is not, I think, just this globalization. It's kind of like, is globalization, when globalization is the specific vectors of globalization are, for example, monopoly capital. When McDonald's is trying to homogenize diets and consumption in not only in the global north but also in the global south, and it also needs to homogenize supply chains, because this process of rationalization, this process of uniformization, is trying to supply uniform inputs and produce uniform outputs. And of course, this implies a violence to human beings and their distinct lives and their distinct cultures by nature of the violence imposed by the needs, the uniformizing and quantifying needs of monopoly capital on a world scale, right? So in this sense, the heterogeneity is being flattened out, right? But I think we need to pay close attention to, the way it's articulated with especially industrialization and commodification.
Mm.
It's the industrialization that needs uniformity, right? Because in fact, in its
Right. Okay.
nature, it's inattentive to biological.
Mm. We've talked a lot then about what the politics of the global south. Does the global north also need agrarian reform?
Yes, there is. There's several facets of agrarian reform that need to be paid attention to. I can talk about the United States cases, although
Hmm.
I think a recent book came out about the land question in uh, Great Britain, showing that the amount of agrarian concentration is simply massive, right? So maybe one of the more unequal northern agrarian structures on the planet. In the United States, I mean, you see Ted Turner. Maybe we listeners won't know the name Ted Turner, but
I
also
don't.
Bill Gates. It's just
Yeah.
some old wealthy dude. Bill Gates, who is definitely well known, right? He is now, I think, the largest or the second largest private landholder
Yeah, he is.
in the United States, right? So we see that the super wealthy are actually grabbing hard assets, not only to maintain the existing agrarian structure, but also to expand it. Now, people definitely don't want to talk about agrarian in the United States. Even though the concentration and the very the racially implicated and the colonially implicated concentration of land in the United States has been getting very, very ever more acute, right? And so we do need agrarian reform uh, on multiple levels. I mean, first of all, I think I always try to point out the decolonization, right? That is the removal of the aspects of the settler dynamics, or what's called land back in the United States, right? Now, it's not a clear map what that looks like, but to support it in principle is to support a change in the agrarian structure of the land mass, which I support. Um, when we talk about changing political rights, defending treaty rights, we're really, in a sense, talking about a form of agrarian reform, right? It's framed in the common discourse, and there's the language is correct to talk about decolonization, but decolonization is about land, right? Which is often not public enough or not loud enough, I think, in the discourse. If you look at the most radical Black movements in the United States, they have very often, and the ones that have been the most punished by the US government, right? They have very often talked about self-determination and land reform and land forms of production based on agrarian Black nationalism, right? This has a very long uh, genealogy in radical Black thinking. Senator Hamer and Malcolm X talked about it. And so they talked about land as being absolutely essential both to the constitution of political communities, but also the constitution of economic production, right? Where people produce for what they need. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the rate of the percentage of Black farmers over the last century has gone from something like 17% to like 1 or 2% of farmers are Black now. So you see a very racialized aspect to the process of agrarian change and agrarian conservation. You also, if you want a society in which people are able to actually steward the land in an effective way and make a good living, then you need to you need to make farms, you need to break up the large farms, essentially, and carry out a radical environment. So it's absolutely essential. And I think it would be ever more essential in a place like the United States as the US would become less reliant on commodity crops from the South, which it now imports at will, basically, right? And it also imports a great deal of commodity crops, for example, from Baja California, that is Mexico, is very reliant on crops from there, in part because of north-south power dynamics and relations. If you want people to actually be stewards and husband people of the land in the United States, then you need a plot of land that is on a human scale rather than something that's 1,000 hectares and only available, only usable by the application of massive technological inputs that exceed any capacity for a kind of regulation of those inputs use according to the ecological or biological cycles needed on the land itself.
And I suppose then the question would be the same. How can we, as my sort of last question, what kind of political reforms can we use alongside agrarian reform to ensure that we don't recreate a kind of serfdom whereby perhaps most people are working on the land and able, therefore, to feed themselves, but they are also producing a surplus, which is then going to an elite class to be put on a globalized market and to be exchanged for capital?
Right. Well, this is why I mean. This is why when we talk about agrarian reform, we always come back to what is the social logic that is governing the society. I mean, this is why, if you want to, when you talk about agrarian reform, you should also talk about anti-capitalism, right? You should also talk about imperialism. We should talk about commodification. We should talk about the ability, a social system in which some people are able to appropriate the fruits of the labor of other people in using coercive power, right? Which is actually the fundamental issue of capitalism. So when we talk about agrarian reform, we also need to talk about all of those other things, which means that, of course, you want a revolutionary change in places like the United States and the United Kingdom. I certainly do. And I think it's worth fighting for because you don't want to reproduce these dynamics of inequality and exclusion and alienation and exploitation and oppression. One wants a society without those things, which means not merely fighting for programs that are just within an unjust social order, but also understanding what is the pattern logic of the social order, namely capitalism, that keeps on reproducing all of these mechanisms of oppression, part and parcel of reproducing itself.
Right. Okay. Max, this has been so interesting. Thank you so much. I can't wait to go away and read more about with everything that you've cited. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Can I name 3 people or can I only name 1 though?
Please.
Okay. I would recommend platforming Lisa Tilley, Archana Prasad, and Keston Perry.
Fantastic. Max, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Yes, thank you so much.
I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon, where you can also read my weekly essays inspired by each podcast interview. The Patreon link is in the description box below. As always, thank you to the Planet Critical community who support the show and make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.